kinds of contents that works of fiction have, but also focusing on interpretive issues about how readers can succeed in identifying these kinds of contents. So there's a lot of emphasis on the existing literature on kind of metaphysical questions about kinds of contents they have, but really almost very little examination of epistemological questions. And today, what I've got to say today is very broad brush. I'm just trying to give you an overall picture of my view and motivate it by showing that I think there's a serious epistemological problem with existing views of one level of fictive content. So people tend to think about fiction as a form of communication, among others. So they think of authors as communicating with readers. And that has certain implications for how readers should be able to identify what's being communicated. And I think these views don't work. I think we have to give up a conception of fiction as a form of communication. So works of fiction have a variety of different levels of content. Some people think there are more levels of content, some people think there are fewer. Clearly, work of fiction has a literal content determined by the conventional rules of language. But in addition, there's what we might call the content of authors' fictive utterances. And this is the level of content that I want to focus on today. And the content of authors' fictive utterances is not exhaustively determined by the rules of language. So I've got two examples on the handout of fictive utterances. Okay, so we have one by Raymond Chandler in The High Window, where he says, "There are ratty hotels where no one except people named Smith and Jones sign the register, and where the night clerk is half watchdog and half panda." Now, a reader misinterprets that utterance if she takes Chandler to be saying that really, literally, only people with the surname Smith and the surname Jones go to that hotel. And she misinterprets that utterance if she takes it that the night clerk is half canine, So it's got, what we think of conversationally implicated is a very tempting way to think about it. I'm going to argue that's the wrong way to think about it. And then we have another fictive utterance from Kafka. This time, it looks like that fictive utterance is to be taken literally. One morning when Gregor Samsa woke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. He lay on his armour-like back, and if he lifted his head a little, he could see his brown belly, slightly domed and divided by arches into stiff sections. Okay, so I take myself to be addressing not a normative question about how we should interpret fictive utterances, but I take it that we do succeed, as a matter of fact, generally in interpreting these utterances. So it's an issue about how we do that. That's the issue I'm concerned with. So questions. How do readers identify the contents of authors' fictive utterances? Well, this is going to depend on what the determinants of the contents of those utterances are. So it's a related question. What determines the contents of these utterances? And an adequate answer to this, we can think of as a metaphysical question, is subject to an epistemological constraint. So an adequate answer to this question must be consistent with the fact that readers are able to identify the contents of such utterances, given the availability of certain background information and certain assumptions. So it's going to turn out to be an important question what kinds of utterances these utterances are, and then I want to, by examining what kinds of utterances they are, I want to say something about what role authors' intentions play in determining the contents of fictive utterances. And I'm going to argue that they play much less of a role than they are commonly taken to play. So there is a debate, there's a very big debate in aesthetics that might seem to be related to this, but I don't take myself to be contributing to this other debate, and this is the debate, so I'm just mentioning here So to sort of flag that this is not what I'm trying to do. So there's this debate about whether we should take the contents of a literary work to be determined by author's intentions insofar as they're realised in the work, that by the intentions of a hypothetical author ascribed by appropriately informed readers. This debate here really boils down to, ends up being a debate about what kinds of resources readers can legitimately appeal to in order to interpret works. Note that this is a debate in general about literature, not about fiction. Those are overlapping but not identical categories. And the motivations for these different views are stuff like, there's a difference between me communicating with you now, where the vehicle of communication isn't really the focus of your attention. Really, you're just trying to get straight to my intentions. And something like a literary work, which should be the focus. The vehicle should be the focus. That's the kind of motivation for that debate. So I'm concerned with a different issue. That's all I'm trying to say. So I'm just going to skip over the rest of the stuff on the first page of the handout in order to get straight to the issue that I am concerned with. So I'm going to start by looking at a very widely endorsed communicative model of fictive utterances. And this is a view endorsed by Greg Curry, by Kathleen Stock, by David Davies, among others. Okay. And according to this view, fictive utterances are a distinctive kind of illocutionary act which is characterised by a reflexive communicative intention to elicit particular imaginings in an audience. So communicative intentions, in case any of you aren't familiar with this, are intentions to elicit a certain response in an audience, partly in virtue of that audience's recognition of that very intention. Okay? So they've got this reflexive structure, and this is supposed to capture the overtness of communicative intentions. Now, note that because they're supposed to be overt, if fictive utterances are governed by communicative intentions, the background information required to interpret fictive utterances should be information that's readily available to readers. Okay? So people who are concerned with intentionalism sometimes worry about if it's legitimate to read an author's private diaries in order to work out what he or she intended to communicate. If you've got a communicative model, no, because I don't plausibly communicatively intend to convey something to you if you need to go and read my private diary to work out what it is that I'm trying to say. Okay, so the information should be readily available. And on a very common story, in ordinary linguistic context, we identify speakers' communicative intentions by appealing to background information that's available, plus the assumption that people who are trying to communicate with us are conforming to certain conversational maxims or presumptions. So Rhys has these 4 maxims of cooperative exchange, which include the maximum of quality. Say only what you believe to be true and for which you have adequate evidence. So if I say, oh, it's so drafty in here, you appeal to your assumption that I am saying things I believe to be true and painting readily available information that it's just not drafty in here to work out that I'm being ironic. So I think this is very how it's supposed to go. Now, the problem for fiction should be immediately obvious. Authors' fictive utterances can't conform, or don't generally, rather, would be a better way of talking about it, conform to Rhys's maximum of quality. Fiction writers, authors, routinely say things that they don't believe to be true and for which they don't have evidence. So we can't carry over the story about how we identify communicative intentions in ordinary conversational contexts to fiction all that easily, right? There's an immediate problem. Now, Rhys isn't the only account of how we identify communicative intentions. We have what relevance theorists like Sperber and Wilson say about this. They say, well, we can do away with all the 4 individual maxims and we can just appeal to a single presumption of optimal relevance. Okay, and according to the presumption of optimal relevance, speakers' utterances are relevant enough to warrant the processing effort required to interpret them, and are the most relevant utterances that speakers could produce given their abilities and preferences. And this notion of relevance is in turn cashed out in terms of positive cognitive effects that warrant the processing effort required to obtain them. So, and to have a positive cognitive effect, an utterance has to either add to your stock of true beliefs or reduce your stock of false beliefs. And the processing effort required to obtain them, learning the telephone directory isn't relevant because it takes more effort than the kind of epistemic upshot gain required. Okay, so I think it looks, at least at first glance, as if the presumption of optimal relevance is going to be much more helpful than Rhys's maxims when it comes to explaining how we might identify communicative fiction-making intentions. So if fiction is governed by these intentions that Curry, Stock and Davies think govern all of the fictive utterances. Why? Well, Sperber and Wilson suggest that the presumption of optimal relevance can be used to interpret a variety of ordinary linguistic utterances that don't conform to Rhys's maxim of polity. So think about things like requests and advice. If I request something, I'm not saying anything I believe to be true. And if I advise you, So the idea is the presumption of optimal relevance can play a role in interpreting requests and advice because it enables hearers to draw inferences about what actions are being represented as desirable from either the hearer's either the speaker or the hearer's point of view. So if I make a request, I'm representing something as desirable from my point of view, and if I give advice, I'm representing something as desirable from your point of view. So we can sort of see how the presumption of optimal relevance might work here. So if I say to Fiora, could you do something about that window? You can infer that I'm requesting that you open the window, maybe. How does this work? Well, we share a kind of common stock of desires about the real world. No one wants to be trapped in a stuffy room for hours on end. So that information that the room is stuffy is readily available, and the kind of imputing to me the desire to have the window open satisfies your expectations of relevance. Similarly, to do it for advice, say I have a friend who expresses dissatisfaction with his appearance, but he doesn't really want to take any radical steps to alter it. And I might say to him, well, hair doesn't take long to grow. And there I'm kind of non-literally advising him to get a haircut. Right? And similarly, we can work out that I'm representing getting a haircut as desirable to him because imputing that as desirable to him satisfies your expectations of relevance. We already know about his desires. Getting a haircut's a means of, because he's told us, getting a haircut is a means of fulfilling them. Okay, so we can see how it works, and maybe it could work for fiction. Okay, so Curry thinks that fictive utterances are governed by communicative intentions to elicit particular imaginings in an audience. Now, imaginings, unlike beliefs and desires, don't have a direction of fit. Okay, so they don't purport to, or they needn't, represent the way things are. They're not committed to representing how things are, and they're not committed to representing how we'd like them to be either. So I think that raises a problem with appealing to the presumption of optimal relevance to try and explain how we identify the imaginings that authors communicatively intend us to engage in, because imaginings don't generally serve as a means of fulfilling existing desires to affect changes to the external world. I mean, there are some exceptions to this, right? So the kinds of imaginings that pornography elicits might do just that. But I mean, in general, it's not generally true of imaginings that they serve as a means of fulfilling existing desires that we have to do things or to change the world around us. And I also think that, unlike in the case where I know exactly what my friend wants, so I'm able to advise him appropriately, we don't really know enough about our desires to engage in further desires for us to be able to draw on information about our desires to engage in further imagining. So it's not that we have a common stock of existing desires to imagine things that would ground inferences about what other imaginings authors might be communicatively intending us to engage in. So I think there's a real epistemological problem with this account. It's just unclear, given the nature of the imagination, how we are supposed to draw inferences about how we are supposed to be able to identify which imaginings authors are inviting us to engage in. And there are a number of steps or a number of responses that I think advocates of this view of fictive utterance might make. One is to appeal to interpretive holism, right? So the idea is, so you go back to the quote on the first page, the quote from the opening passage of Metamorphosis. Maybe when we first read that, we're tempted to take it metaphorically. We think, someone can't really turn into an insect, but a vermin. But as we go on and read more of Metamorphosis, it becomes clear to us that, in fact, we are to take Kafka's utterance literally in this case. So the idea is that where in ordinary linguistic cases we have real-world background information to appeal to, if we think about the interpretation of fiction holistically, maybe the internal linguistic context can do the work that in ordinary cases real-world background information does. Maybe an internal linguistic context can do all the work. That's the idea. So the idea is, as we interpret, we try on different possible ways of interpreting authors' utterances, and we come to a kind of reflective equilibrium of interpretation across the whole story. The problem, or one problem with that kind of response, I think, is that whereas the notion of a reflective equilibrium requires some notion of coherence. We want a coherent interpretation. It's clear what counts as a coherent interpretation of things in the real world, constrained by nomological laws, things like that. Not so in fiction, right? So what counts as a coherent interpretation of Raymond Chandler's detective novel, The High Window, it has to be psychologically plausible, things like that. It's not the same as what counts as a coherent interpretation of Metamorphosis. It doesn't even have to be consistent with nomological laws. So then you might say, oh, well, genre can do some work here. looks like the coherence requirements for fiction vary according to the genre of the work of fiction. And I think that's true. And I also think that it's true in some instances that readers approach a fiction in full knowledge of what the genre of that work is. You know, people buy Mills and Boon's novels because they know that they're getting a romance of a certain sort, right? But this is certainly not true for all fiction. Rather, in many cases, and certainly not true for all fictions that we are still able readily to interpret. So I think in many cases, you know, we make hypotheses about genre as we go along. It's not kind of overt knowledge, background knowledge that we have to draw on. So I don't think this response is going to work. A move that David Davies makes, it's not in response to this problem, because I don't think advocates of this view even know that there is this problem. I'm accusing them of having. But David Davies says, oh, but you know, interpretation can work by appeal to sort of Rhysian maxims, but we're not using appealing to those maxims to ascribe beliefs to the actual author. Rather, we're ascribing beliefs to an internal narrator of the story. Okay, so that does seem true, that if the person's internal and taken to be truth-telling, we kind of avoid them the problem. But the problem is you only have the internal linguistic, you've got the same kind of problem, right? You have to get some content up and running before that strategy is going to be one that you can appeal to. Okay, so that's why I think this view of fictive utterances as governed by communicative intentions to get readers to imagine things raises what I think are insuperable epistemological problems. Now, there is another view of the nature of fictive utterances on the marketplace, and this is the one advocated by Munro Beardsley. And he says, he denies that fictive utterances are actual illocutionary acts. Rather, he says they're representations of illocutionary acts. And as representations of illocutionary acts rather than actual illocutionary acts, he thinks that they're convention governed. Okay, so readers work out what the contents of authors' fictive utterances are by appealing to, drawing on their tacit knowledge of certain conventions. But now the problem becomes that of saying what the relevant conventions are, such that they allow authors to say things non-literally, right? Such as to render readily interpretable utterances like the one of Chandler's. So they can't be ordinary linguistic conventions, they need to be some other kind of convention. And Beardsley doesn't kind of give us an explanation here. But I want to kind of go down this Beardsleyan line and argue that interpreting fiction isn't a matter of identifying intentions, rather it is, we do interpret fictions by appeal to tacit knowledge of certain conventions. Okay. So the account of the nature of fictive utterances that I want to give is, and this is all very broad brush, so sorry about that. I want to argue that fictive utterances are declarations. Okay, so declarations are a distinctive kind of illocutionary act that is capable, that acts that are capable of affecting changes to the status of their objects simply in virtue of their successful performance. So take, for example, surrendering. Simply in virtue of performing the act of surrendering, I make it the case that I am no longer at war. Acquitting, canonizing, marrying, those are all examples of declarations. And declarations are not governed by communicative intentions. They do have to be intentional mostly, I think. Rather they are convention governed. And they're governed by a particular kind of convention. They're governed by the constitutive rules of institutions. So note that all declarations require or are grounded in institutions. So the act of marrying is grounded in the institution. Marriage, the act of canonizing, is grounded in the institution of the Roman Catholic Church, etc., etc. So similarly, I want to say that fictive utterances are grounded in the institution of fiction. Okay, so there's an institution, and it's comprised, I'm just going to follow Searle here, it's comprised of a system of constitutive rules. So a constitutive rule is a result of collective assignments of status functions. And status functions are functions that things perform not intrinsically and not in virtue of possessing certain physical features, but simply because a community collectively accepts that they have that function. So the function of being an ironing board is not a function that anything has intrinsically, but it's still not a status function because it's a function that things can only perform in virtue of having certain physical features, right? Contrast that with the function being money. Okay? What pieces of paper with certain patterns on them, with certain kind of history of production, count as money simply because a community collectively accepts that they have that function. It wouldn't matter if it might be a bit inconvenient to carry around rocks, but we could give the function money to rocks or whatever as well. There's nothing special about their physical features. Okay, so similarly, I think the institution fiction consists in a system of constitutive rules which have the form X counts as Y in context C. Now, what's special about the institution of fiction? Well, the purpose of the institution, I think, is to do something like enhance human powers of imagination. Something to do with the imagination, right? So I think this gives the institution of fiction some rules that are kind of distinguish it from lots of other institutions. So the idea is that X counts as Y in context C rule. Because we collectively accept these rules, they're rules that make certain things the case according to the institution of fiction. So the rules that govern the contents of fiction, of fictive utterances. So in particular, these rules have the form in context C, an utterance that meets conditions X, count as making things as a speaker would describe them as being were she to make that utterance in a situation S. Okay. So the idea is this, and I'm going to do that sort of cheeky thing where I go, oh, it's the job of the literary theorist, not the philosopher, to tell us what all the actual individual rules are. I'm just giving you the structure and solving this problem. But the idea is these rules incorporate a role, an interpretive role, for something like Rhys's maxims of conversation or the presumption of optimal relevance. Okay? So they say of utterances, real world utterances with certain linguistic features. In certain contexts, utterances with those particular linguistic features count as making it the case, according to the institution of fiction, that things are a certain way. Things are as a speaker would describe them as being were she to make that utterance in a particular situation. So, for example, we've got an example of one such rule. In context C, an utterance that meets condition X has certain linguistic features. counts as making things as a member of the author's own community would describe them as being, were she sincerely to speak the words comprising their utterance. Okay. So we can understand something like Chandler's utterance as being interpreted according to some such rule. So the idea is we do draw on Brycean maxims or something like it, but basically it's because we've got a rule that tells us what role they're playing. And of course, once you've got some of the work of fiction, some fictive, internal fictive content up and running, so you know what's going on, what's true according to that fiction, you can have further constitutive rules of fiction that appeal to the already established internal linguistic context. So an example might be 2. In context C, an utterance that meets condition X, so for example, which is punctuated in a manner indicative of dialogue, counts as making it the case that a speaker utters the words comprising their utterance and describes things as being the way a speaker would describe them as being, were she sincerely to speak the words comprising that utterance in the fictional context at issue. A bit wordy, admittedly. Okay, so that's my claim. We interpret fiction by appealing to these constitutive rules which give a certain interpretive role to the kinds of resources we use to interpret ordinary non-literal utterances in ordinary linguistic contexts. Now, an interesting problem arises in spelling out what the contextual, how we should fill out the context C in these rules. So this is what I was going to have on the slide. I can just read it to you. There's a certain problem that arises that looks like sometimes we are to interpret utterances of a given type in one way, and sometimes we are to interpret utterances of the same type in a different way. So sometimes those utterances seem to fall under a rule, and sometimes they don't. I think this can tell us something about how we should cash out condition C. So I'm going to give you an example from Kendall Walton. He quotes this passage from Othello. It says, had it pleased heaven to try me with affliction, had they rained all kinds of sores and shames on my bare head, stick me in poverty to the very lips, given to captivity me in my utmost hopes, I should have found in some place in my soul a drop of patience, but alas. Okay, so these words in Othello are represented as spoken by Othello. And Walton asks, how did Othello, a Moorish general and hardly an intellectual, manage to come up with such superb verse on the spur of the moment and when immensely distraught? Apparently, he is to be credited with an almost unbelievable natural literary flair. And there are literary critics who raise a very similar problem. So the critic James Wood writes, who really thinks that it's Leopold Bloom in the midst of his stream of consciousness who notices the flabby gush of porter as it's poured in a drain, or appreciates the buzzing prongs of a fork in a restaurant? And in such fine words, these exquisite perceptions and beautifully precise phrases are Joyce's, and the reader has to make a treaty whereby we accept that Bloom will sometimes sound like Bloom and sometimes sound more like Joyce. This is as old as literature. Shakespeare's characters sound like themselves and always like Shakespeare too. It's not really Cornwall who wonderfully calls Gloucester's eye a vile jelly before he rips it out, though Cornwall speaks the words, but Shakespeare who has provided the phrase. So the idea that both of these authors are alluding to is the idea that, well, it seems to be a kind of convention that, you know, if a character is represented as, you know, speaking certain words, they're to be taken as having uttered just those words, but sometimes it doesn't really. Sometimes we kind of distort interpretation to take them to have done so. Here's a much more kind of mundane example. Think about English language novelists writing novels set in foreign countries. So Rhys is an example of this. Okay, she's got this novel, Good Morning Midnight, and it's set in Paris. And here's just a very brief extract. She says, "Le peintre," he says, "il est fou le peintre. Did you like him?" "Yes, I liked him very much." He lays his glass carefully down on the table. "Will you have a coffee, madame?" "No, I'll have a brandy, please." He looks anxious, orders the brandy and a coffee for himself. "God, this is awful." "Le peintre," he says, "he's mad. I don't know why he has been so impolite, but it's just what he would do." So here, Rhys is shifting between, presumably when she's writing in French, where to take her the character to be represented as speaking just those French words that are attributed to him. But when she flips into English, presumably we are to take that character to be speaking French words with roughly the meaning of the English words that he's represented as uttering or as attributing. And I think this shows us that the C conditions in these constitutive rules, I'm claiming govern the interpretation of fiction, factor in authors, not their communicative intentions, but their ordinary, non-reflexive intentions to achieve certain purposes. So in the case of Shakespeare, that purpose is something like aesthetic pleasure. Why does Shakespeare have Othello speak so poetically? Not because he thinks Othello or someone like Othello really would say those words in the context at issue, but because he wants to give aesthetic pleasure to his readers. Okay, so he's operating on more than one level. In the Rhys example, I think her intention is not aesthetic pleasure, but comprehensibility. So she wants to render the content of her fiction accessible to predominantly English-speaking audiences. She puts a bit of French in there to give us flavour, some easy words that we probably know the meaning of or won't matter too much if we don't. But her purpose there is to make her fiction interpretable by people for whom English is their main language. So I think they're going to have, and here I'm going to be hand-wavy. It can't be just any purpose. There are going to have to be some restrictions on what purposes can factor into these C conditions. And I think that's going to depend on what kind of thing we take fiction to be. I think it's going to have to somehow be imaginary. Here's what I don't really know what to say. So in the case of literature, it seems legitimate, and now maybe it's here where we're discussing a normative issue. In the case of literature, it seems like aesthetic pleasure is very important, right? Kind of values, kind of seeking to realise. But I think if we're merely concerned with fiction, I think the purposes have to be imagination conducive or something like that, because that claims the nature of the institution. Okay, so in summary, on the kind of view I'm advocating, we don't interpret fictive utterances by identifying authors' communicative intentions. We interpret them by drawing on our knowledge of certain kinds of conventions, which nonetheless incorporate an interpretive role for the kinds of resources we use to interpret utterances in ordinary communicative cases. There is a role for authors' intentions in determining whether or not their utterances fall under the scope of given constitutive rules, but the intentions at issue are not communicative intentions, and note also that those intentions aren't content determining. So it's Rhys's desire or intention to render the work accessible It's not her intention to have the character say such and such that's doing any work here. That's all I've got to say. Thank you very much.